Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Gabe Gutierrez reporting in Washington, where we're following two major stories, one in Manhattan and the other here on Capitol Hill, affecting the two most powerful Republicans in the country. In the House, Republican Speaker Kevin McCarthy is now facing a potential vote to oust him as Speaker after this weekend's successful scramble to temporarily avert a government shutdown. We'll have much more on those developments in a moment, but we begin with breaking news out of New York, where the first day of the former president's biggest trial yet as a presidential candidate is about to wrap up. Today, a Manhattan judge heard opening statements in the New York Attorney General's $250 million fraud lawsuit against Donald Trump, his company, and two of his sons. It is a case unlike any other facing the former president, as it threatens to undermine the very core of his business brand and public persona. The former president, as well as the New York AG, were in the courtroom for today's proceedings, and Mr. Trump spoke to reporters as he arrived at court and again during recess, lashing out at the case and calling it part of a vast government conspiracy to undermine his presidential candidacy.
This is a continuation of the single greatest witch hunt of all time. A rogue judge who ruled that properties are worth a tiny fraction, a tiny fraction of what they actually are. We have a racist attorney general who's a horror show, who ran on the basis that she was going to get Trump before she even knew anything about me.
Those comments were a familiar page from Donald Trump's playbook to personally attack judges or prosecutors in cases where he faces significant legal peril. The Attorney General responded to Mr. Trump's comments as she arrived at court this morning.
My message is simple. No matter how powerful you are, no matter how much money you think you may have, no one is above the law. And it is my responsibility and my duty and my job to enforce it.
The lawsuit accuses Donald Trump of lying about his net worth by billions of dollars to get bank loans. The judge presiding over the case has already ruled on some aspects of the case, last week declaring that Mr. Trump had committed fraud and lied about his net worth for years. The judge also ordered some of his business licenses be rescinded, threatening Mr. Trump's ability to do business in New York. And this trial is the first of at least 6 civil and criminal trials facing Mr. Trump as he seeks the Republican Party's nomination in 2024. NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard is live for us outside the courthouse in Lower Manhattan. And with me will be Jeremy Salad, former assistant district attorney in the trial division of the Manhattan DA's office. Vaughn, I want to start with you. What actually happened in the courtroom today?
This was about hour 8 now in which the courtroom has been convened here. There were multiple breaks as well as a lunch break. But for Donald Trump, the former president, despite not having to be in the courtroom today, he is there. And there were questions of whether he would remain through the afternoon, and he's still in there. For Donald Trump, this is an opportunity to hear his own attorneys, Chris Keiss, as well as Alina Habba, speak and defend him in front of this judge who will ultimately determine the extent to which he is liable for the financial fraud claims that New York Attorney General Letitia James has brought in this lawsuit against him. Currently on the stand is the first witness, the former accountant for Donald Trump, the personal accountant who worked on his tax returns for about a decade, and he is being questioned right now by the New York Attorney General's prosecutors about exactly the machinations of Alan Weisselberg, the chief financial officer, and Michael Cohen, the two sons who are also defendants, Don Jr. and Eric Trump, the extent to which Donald Trump was aware of the valuations of his assets and properties that amounted to, as the Attorney General in her lawsuit claims, either undervaluation or overvaluation that led to Donald Trump increasing his self-worth by potentially upwards of $2 billion.
And, you know, Vaughn, we saw that video a little earlier today of Letitia James and Donald Trump in that courtroom. How much can we expect their presence throughout this trial?
We should not expect Donald Trump to be in the courtroom for that many days. Again, he does not have to be there. Letitia James is not the one who is actually presenting this case in front of the judge either, yet she was in the gallery sitting a few rows behind Donald Trump. She did speak here from the steps of the courthouse in Lower Manhattan before the trial officially began this morning. But for the two of these individuals, this is a storied history in which Letitia James, when she ran for New York Attorney General, said that she would investigate and if the investigation warranted it, bring Donald Trump to justice. And Donald Trump, upon leaving for lunch break, according to our producer Adam Reese inside of the room, glared at her as he walked by and left the courtroom. For Donald Trump, there is so much on the line, not only a $250 million potential financial penalty, but also the elimination of his business certificates and his ability to operate here in New York City. Well, Donald Trump, so much is politically on the line for him in this 2024 presidential run. It's the future, not only for him, but also his family business that is on the line in this courtroom in the months ahead.
And Vaughn, you just said months ahead. This trial is expected to last quite a while, right, as we look at live pictures there outside the courtroom.
Right. The judge suggested that this could go all the way through December 22nd here. This is going to be a trial that takes place 5 days a week. There are no video cameras allowed, so there is not going to be a live feed. The video that you watched just a few moments ago was our photographer being allowed on behalf of all of the major TV networks to go and shoot about 2 minutes of what the courtroom looked like with Donald Trump, Letitia James, and the judge inside of that courtroom. But for Donald Trump, if he wants to know how his attorneys are representing him. Of course, Donald Trump has a long history of being very fickle about his legal representation, including firing multiple of them over the last year related to other cases. For Donald Trump, the one way to hear how his defense is presenting the case for him is by being inside of that courtroom, and that's exactly where he is today. We'll wait to see whether he is back here tomorrow, Gabe.
Vaughn Hilliard in Lower Manhattan. Vaughn, thanks. I want to bring in Jeremy. Jeremy, explain for us the merits of this New York lawsuit.
Well, it actually has merits. I mean, keep in mind that the court has already ruled, as we all have heard, on the summary judgment motion, saying that the evidence existed there at that point for enough facts, if you will, that there didn't need to be a ruling later on or a trial where a jury, or in this case, a judge, had that separate proceeding. So it seems to be a strong case on its face, though there seems to be real issues. But at the same time, keep in mind, this is not a criminal proceeding. It's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's preponderance of the evidence. It's very distinct and separate from what we've been hearing out of D.C., for example, and Georgia.
And Jeremy, you just mentioned that this is not a criminal proceeding, but Donald Trump does have a lot at stake in this trial.
Absolutely. Jail is not an issue here, but really his livelihood, his ability to conduct his business, and basically tearing down, that wall behind who he really is, if in fact Letitia James and the Attorney General's office also not just already established the one issue that has already been presented to the judge, but the issues in terms of insurance fraud and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, the other outstanding matters. We're talking real dollars here, $250 million potentially. We're talking about severing his ability to deal with banks in New York for the foreseeable future. And not just him, keep in mind, this is his children as well.
And Jeremy, I want to play part of what Donald Trump told reporters during a recess today. Let's take a listen.
This rogue judge, a Trump hater, the only one that hates Trump more is his associate up there, his person that works with him. She's screaming into his ear on almost every time we ask a question. A disgrace.
Jeremy, have you ever seen a scenario in which a defendant in a case, civil or criminal, attacks the judge as the trial is beginning from right outside the courtroom?
Short answer is really no. And this is a desperate, desperate man. It's almost like he's a cornered raccoon and or some other animal that got into your garden, and he's got no other choice but to lash out as you get closer and closer. That's his defensive mechanism. It's not going to help him. As we've noted many times, this is a bench trial, not a jury trial. So the judge is going to hear some of this, although the judge should be ignoring all of it. But this is going to be his own demise. And remember as well that the Attorney General can call him as a witness, unlike in a criminal case, they can't force you. But he may be testifying in this trial, and we, meaning the American public, are going to hear whether he's going to implode or be on that stand in a calm, reasoned manner.
Look, and Jeremy, look, supporters of the former president might make the argument that this isn't that big of a deal. Could you make the argument that exaggerating or underreporting assets is widespread, and you could bring similar allegations against many developers, especially in New York?
Yeah, I mean, that's not a defense that has merit. And also, to the extent or magnitude that is alleged here is quite different. I am sure there's fraud that exists everywhere. I think we'd be naive and ignorant to assert otherwise. But to this magnitude, to this amount in these dollars, that's not fair. It probably isn't that much. We know the Attorney General's office does these type of white-collar investigations. But merely saying, someone else did it, so therefore I can do it, that's not a defense. That's not a defense. You just happen to get caught. And, it makes you wonder whether or not, the former president rues the day he ran for president and subjected himself to this kind of, oversight and review. But that's not a defense. That's not going to fly, especially before a judge.
And Jeremy, put this in the context here. Of the civil trials that he's facing, is this one perhaps the most existential threat to the former president?
It's not even existential. It's real. It's immediate and very legitimate, for lack of a better term. The president is not, the risk at losing a few $1 million in a defamation case. If this ultimately plays out, and no doubt there'll be appeals throughout the process when this case closes, this can be or spell ruin for him. Trump Tower and that gold shimmering fakeness may be exposed if the Attorney General is successful. This can really be debilitating. And I'm saying that kindly. It could be much worse. Whether it is, we'll find out.
And Jeremy, finally, do you see any scenario in which Donald Trump actually testifies at this trial?
Testifies in his own defense. Normally I would say never would I put a man like him with his inability to stay focused on the stand. But as I noted before, in a civil proceeding, he may be called. So the question remains, do you want to take the wind out of the prosecution's sails and put yourself out there and get your evidence out in the best, cleanest way possible, not being on their case, but on your own, is a real question to be asked. But generally speaking, no. In the criminal trials, I can't imagine he's testifying.
Jeremy Salan, thank you so much for joining us here on Meet the Press Now. Thank you. And coming up, shutdown averted, at least for now. We'll have the latest on what happens next, plus a one-on-one interview with one of the House Republicans who voted no on the 11th hour deal to keep the government open. Plus, President Biden is set to convene a cabinet meeting minutes from now as the White House faces the fallout from that stopgap funding bill that does not have any additional aid for Ukraine. You're watching Meet the Press Now. And welcome back. On Capitol Hill right now, the House is back in session after surprising much of Washington by barely avoiding a government shutdown this weekend. But what it took to get across the finish line leaves House Speaker Kevin McCarthy now facing a renewed effort to oust him as Speaker. Today, Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz, arguably McCarthy's fiercest critic, vowed to hold a vote to topple the Speaker after McCarthy was forced to rely on House Democrats to pass a short-term spending deal to keep the government open for another 45 days.
Kevin McCarthy's true coalition partner on all things of substance has been the Democrats this Congress. He worked with Democrats on the debt limit bill, and only Democrats are really campaigning on that bill. Republicans aren't campaigning on the debt limit bill. That was a Democrat bill, passed with mostly Democrat votes. Then we get to the appropriations process, and Speaker McCarthy purposefully delayed us. He tried to back us up against shutdown politics. He tried to not pass single subject spending bills. And at the end of the day, he had to utilize Democrats to pass a continuing resolution.
Explain the timing of this.
Yeah, I'm going to be doing it this week.
If this does fail, will you bring this up again?
Yeah.
Speaker McCarthy, for his part, has all but dared Congressman Gaetz to bring up that vote. He spoke to reporters today, defending his actions over the weekend while rebuking hardliners in his caucus.
Well, I've heard a lot of criticism frustrated inside the conference about having the most conservative stopgap measure that would secure the border and cut spending, and we couldn't pass it. So then we sat there, we talked, and we were all frustrated because there wasn't very many options as a majority if you can't control your own destiny. We watched the frustration for the weeks past where people would hijack the floor and not let us pass anything, or not let us bring up the appropriation bills time and again. So there were very few options to do. And in listening to everybody, they elected me to be Speaker, so I made a decision. I thought it was best to keep the government open.
The whole saga puts McCarthy in a box and potentially looking to Democrats as the firewall to save his speakership. That's if Gaetz can get hardliners inside his caucus to actually go through with the extremely rare maneuver to try to oust their own speaker. House Democratic leadership, meanwhile, remain coy about what they do or what their demands would be if McCarthy needs them. And joining me now for the latest is Ryan Nobles from Capitol Hill on his cell phone in the halls of Congress. So, Ryan, for those who last tuned in, you know, it sure looked like we were heading to government shutdown over the weekends. For those that may have been looking at this on Friday, bring us up to speed. How did we get here? Tell us about this dramatic weekend, and where does the funding fight go from here, Ryan?
Yeah, first of all, Gabe, I will stop at nothing to get on Meet the Press. You know that. I'm committed to the cause, no doubt. But yeah, basically we found ourselves in this position because a group of Republican hardliners from the conservative wing of the party insisted when in their negotiations with Kevin McCarthy that they had an all or nothing strategy. Either wanted 12 appropriations bills passed with laden with conservative policies, or they wanted nothing. And Kevin McCarthy woke up on Saturday morning and realized that that just wasn't practical and that the government was going to shut down. So at the 11th hour, he decided to put a clean short-term spending bill on the floor, just threw in a little bit of disaster relief. It extended things like the federal flood insurance program and the FAA authorization, and that at least bought him some time to continue the negotiation. The issue here now is whether or not that's going to make him endangered, because these conservative Republicans have insisted that they are not going to support any kind of short-term spending bill. And it required Democrats in order to get it over the finish line. That's an important point, Gabe, when we talk about this, that there were more Democrats that voted for this bill than there were Republicans. And so now Kevin McCarthy's in a situation here where he's trying to navigate two things: protecting his speakership while at the same time trying to come up with a long-term spending package that needs to be done now by the middle of November. And talking about that spending package, Ryan, are Ukraine and the border, are they going to remain the sticking points that they have been? Gabe, I actually think that those may be opportunities for both Republicans and Democrats. There's no question that they're both controversial on some level. There are many House Republicans, conservative House Republicans, that aren't in favor of continuing to just fund Ukraine without any kind of preconditions or special accommodation and oversight of the Biden administration handling out that money. But at the same time, the issues related to the border are becoming a problem for both Republicans and Democrats. You're seeing, governors and mayors in states that are far away from the southern border expressing concern with the Biden administration that something needs to be done at the border. So I do think that this offers both sides an opportunity to come to the table and say, let's offer up a Ukraine package that has that oversight that Republicans want, while at the same time coming up with some sort of strategy to deal with the situation at the border. And perhaps that's the bipartisan agreement that everybody can be happy with. There's certainly members on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party that are uncomfortable with any kind of limitations on migrants, particularly those seeking asylum from coming over the border. But there's also widespread realization that something needs to change, and this may be the vehicle to provide that change, Gabe. So, Ryan, it's no secret that Matt Gaetz typically likes attention, but how much support does he actually have with his threats to oust the speaker? Well, Gabe, if I'm to guess, if I thought that Matt Gaetz had those 5 Republican votes that it would need to truly put Kevin McCarthy's speakership in jeopardy, he wouldn't have forecasted that this vote would be coming later in the week. I think he would have pulled the trigger as quickly as possible. So reading between the tea leaves, my sense of this, and, he continues to play coy as to exactly what kind of support he has. That reads to me that he's still trying to convince a few of his Republican colleagues to come on board. Now, he may be close to doing that, and he may at least have some assurances from them that they're keeping their options open, that they're not definitively a no. But my sense is if he had 5 Republican votes, he would have moved already. And at this point, he's still whip counting to try and get to that point where he can truly embarrass Kevin McCarthy. Because if he puts that vote on the floor and Kevin McCarthy survives, even if he has to survive with the support of Democrats, that really isolates Matt Gaetz, and it really just will force him to continue to be what most people already accuse him of, and that's just somebody who goes on TV and cries about stuff, doesn't necessarily get anything done. Ryan Nobles on Capitol Hill. Ryan, thanks so much. And joining me now here on set is Colorado Republican Congressman Ken Buck.
Congressman, thank you so much for joining us here on Meet the Press Now. So I want to begin on the funding bill. You voted against both continuing resolutions. In light of the deal with Democrats, do you regret voting down the first one?
No, not at all. We have soon coming up $36 trillion of debt. That is too much. Kevin McCarthy promised that we would have a vote on every single of the 12 appropriations bills. That should have started in June. It should have started in July. We would have been where we needed to at this point, and that is having passed those bills, giving Kevin the opportunity to negotiate with the Senate on each of those bills. The fact that he didn't do it was just more of this crisis management. We had the same thing with the debt limit. It was last minute. The world was looking to see what we would do, and he forced a vote on that and promised President Biden much more, $200 billion more of spending than he promised Republicans when he ran for Speaker. So the message is very clear to Kevin McCarthy. You've got to stick to your promises and make sure we get these bills done.
Would it have been worth it, though, to shut the government down?
No, it wouldn't have been worth it at all. But that is on Kevin McCarthy. It's not worth it in June when you don't start putting appropriations bills on the floor. And this has been going on now for 27 years. We haven't passed our appropriations bills because the Speaker and the leader of the Senate decide at the last minute what the deal is going to be. That isn't inclusive of members of Congress, and it shouldn't happen.
So, Congressman, you mentioned that it's on Kevin McCarthy. Regarding Matt Gaetz's potential motion to vacate, would you support that? Would you want to oust the Speaker?
I want to hear what Kevin McCarthy has to say about why $36 trillion of debt is okay. I want to hear what he has to say about why we haven't had 12 appropriations bills. I want to know what the side deals were with Hakeem Jeffries, a leader of the Democrat Party in the House, regarding Ukraine, regarding other things.
Now, the Speaker says he didn't talk to the Biden administration about Ukraine funding. I know on the floor today, Matt Gaetz said that there was an alleged secret deal, but McCarthy says that's not what happened.
Well, the president says that's what happened. The president said, I'm going to hold Kevin to his commitment to bring up Ukraine funding. When the president of the United States says that, he doesn't have a dog in this fight, and he made it very clear that Kevin McCarthy made that commitment.
So just to be clear, though, at this point, you're a maybe when it comes to ousting Speaker McCarthy.
I am. Let's put everything on the table and see who is going to be the best person to lead us into a fiscally responsible spending pattern.
At this point, who else could lead the Republicans at this point?
I think there are a number of really good candidates. They're not going to put their heads up. Well, I'm not going to go through their names because they don't want to identify themselves while Kevin is Speaker. There is something about loyalty to the boss at this point. But if Kevin is no longer the Speaker, he loses the motion to vacate, I think you're going to see a lot of good people step forward.
Is one of those named Ken Buck?
No.
You sure?
Worst job in America, and I guarantee you Ken Buck and Matt Gaetz is not one of those people. I might get 3 votes. Matt would get 1.
Do you think Matt Gaetz is just out for attention here?
No, I don't. I think there's a real issue in D.C., and the insiders in D.C. have played this game around appropriations for years. I credit Matt with making sure that we're going to move down this path. I think it could have been done a little more delicately at times, but certainly give Matt credit.
So if it fails on the first try, if he puts forward this motion to vacate, but he keeps doing it over and over again, and the House grinds to a halt, what then?
Well, that doesn't happen. I don't think Matt is that tone deaf. Kevin McCarthy is that tone deaf in what he's done with spending, but I don't think Matt is that tone deaf.
You don't think that Matt Gaetz would grind the House to a halt?
No, I don't.
Really don't think that?
No.
He did several months ago, during the speakership process, when more than a dozen times there was votes for Speaker. The House grounded to a halt back then.
Well, so first of all, I thought that was really healthy. I think when you're talking about a deliberative body that goes through a process like that, it's not unhealthy. But there were, I think the first vote for Kevin McCarthy, there were 22 people that objected to him being Speaker. And then that came down and down as Kevin was negotiating with different people. But it wasn't just Matt Gaetz that ground anything to a halt. People didn't swear allegiance to Matt Gaetz. There were a lot of people that had concerns with Kevin.
Do you trust Kevin McCarthy right now?
I don't.
You don't?
No.
That says a lot that you would say that about your Speaker of the House at this point.
Well, it's based on making promises that he can't keep to so many different people.
What happens if Democrats sign on to oust Speaker McCarthy? What do you make of that?
Well, Kevin is then forming a coalition government, and the Democrats have then bought somebody that frankly, a lot of them have come up to me and said they don't trust. So there is going to be an interesting coalition that's formed, but I don't think it's going to be based on trust with Kevin.
Now, amidst this government shutdown standoff, the House had its first impeachment inquiry hearing last week. You've been critical of that effort, saying that you've seen no smoking gun connecting the president and his son's business dealings. Did you see any new evidence at that first hearing that would change your mind?
No, just the opposite. Professor Jonathan Turley said there isn't enough evidence for an impeachment at this point because there isn't that link between Hunter Biden's activities, which, by the way, are sleazy, and Joe Biden's status as vice president and his actions as vice president.
So do you think that there could be a smoking gun here?
Oh, there could be.
But this is the first hearing. Wouldn't they have brought their best evidence in that first hearing?
Sure. And when I met with the investigators at the Oversight Committee, they told me this is an ongoing investigation. And so I think they're looking for that. But the problem with calling it an impeachment inquiry is you raise expectations. They were doing a great job, judiciary, oversight, ways and means, of investigating what happened. It should have stayed at that level.
But to be clear, you don't think they have a smoking gun at this point?
They do not have a smoking gun. I'm sure of that.
Representative Ken Buck of Colorado, thank you so much for joining us here on Meet the Press Now.
Thank you.
We appreciate your time. And up next, what's next for California Democrats after losing a legend? Governor Gavin Newsom names his choice to fill the Senate seat held by the late Dianne Feinstein, as plans are made to honor the trailblazing lawmaker. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Stay with us. And welcome back. California Governor Gavin Newsom announced he is picking LaFonza Butler to fill the late Dianne Feinstein Senate seat. Butler, the current president of Emily's List, a prominent advocacy organization dedicated to electing female Democrats, will be the Senate's first black openly LGBT member when she's sworn in later this week. Butler will also be the third black woman to serve in the Senate. Newsom had long promised that if the time came, he would fill Feinstein's seat with a black woman. And while Butler is eligible to seek a full term in November 2024, there is already a robust and well-funded group of candidates running for the seat. Well-known representatives Barbara Lee, Katie Porter, and Adam Schiff are already campaigning. Perhaps as a message to other candidates and potential candidates, Schiff announced yesterday he raised more than $6 million for his campaign in the third quarter, giving him a massive war chest of $32 million. Feinstein, who died Thursday at the age of 90, will lie in state at San Francisco City Hall on Wednesday ahead of a private funeral on Thursday. That City Hall building is where then Board of Supervisors President Dianne Feinstein announced to the world the assassinations of Harvey Milk and Mayor George Moscone, and where she later served as mayor for a decade. And we'll get to that story in just a moment, but we want to turn now to some breaking news where former President Trump is speaking now in Lower Manhattan. Let's take a listen.
So based on the judge's comments at the end of the trial today, it would appear that he is agreeing that all of the transactions that closed prior to 2014 are now out of the case.
Which is about 80% of the case. And it's also something that we won on appeal, but was not accepted by this court, but now seems to be accepted by this court. As far as the jury is concerned, it's much different now, I must tell you, than it was 20 minutes ago. We were going to come out and complain that, in this country you're entitled to a jury. But we very much appreciate the judge's decision today, or his statement today, on statute of limitations, which is a very big thing. There's a limited time period. And we did nothing wrong. And if you look at the statements, they showed that even in 2011, I guess the number was $258 million in cash, a very strong company. I don't believe we really, maybe I wouldn't do a couple of deals or something, but I wouldn't have even needed to go to banks. Banks loved our business, they loved our deals, they weren't defrauded, they lost no money, they made money, they had the finest attorneys that there are. Frankly, their attorneys were better than my attorneys. And they made a lot of money, and they considered me a very good client. I paid them back on time, on schedule. There was no default. They never even sent me a default letter. Not one. For years, never got a default letter. And there's no case here. There's no victim. The banks aren't a victim. The insurance companies are a victim. Everybody got paid. It's a terrible, terrible thing. This was for politics. Now, it has been very successful for them because they took me off the campaign trail. Because I've been sitting in a courthouse all day long instead of being in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, or a lot of other places I could be at. This is a horrible situation for our country. It's never happened before. It's election interference. They're interfering with the presidential election of 2024, and the people of our country see it. But this was a big, I say surprise, but it was a great credit to the court that the judge was willing to do this. He sort of overruled himself, and I greatly respect that. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Are you back tomorrow?
We may. I'd love not to. I'd love to be campaigning instead of doing this. Because I built a great company. That's one thing people are seeing. All the way back to 2011. And today, it's much bigger and much better and even much more liquid. That was $258 million for a real estate developer. That's a lot of money. It was in 2011. Today, it's much more than that. Much, much more. I built a great company. It did great things for New York. And they should respect that. I've employed thousands and thousands of people in New York. And they should respect that. The Attorney General of this state is a disgrace. Letitia James is a disgrace. She's a disgrace to our country and to the state of New York. She should focus on all of the violent crime and the murders going on in New York, not on somebody that paid back the banks in full without a default, and in many cases paid them back early. Thank you very much, everybody.
And that is former President Donald Trump speaking in Lower Manhattan after the first full day of his civil trial wraps up here in New York. I'm joined now by NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos. And Danny, Donald Trump saying several things there that we've heard time and time again, calling this election interference, saying he did nothing wrong, saying that everybody got paid. But what I want to come to you is what he just talked about, the ruling, he said, from the judge in the last 20 minutes or so, limiting the amount of transactions in this case. Since we don't have cameras in the courtroom, we're just getting this information right now and just exactly what transpired in that courtroom. But I wonder if you might be able to shed some light on that. What was Donald Trump talking about?
It could be, and of course, no cameras, relying only on reporting that is squeaking out of that courtroom at the very end of the day. But there reportedly may be some indication that Justice Engoron is warming to the idea of the statute of limitations argument. That would be a little unusual because it seems as though he already decided that. He may also be limiting the scope of evidence that is admissible. That could arguably be a minor victory for the Trump team in that some of the evidence coming in, for example, maybe the judge concluded that it's time barred or it's too old, too stale to be of probative value. But again, this is somewhat speculation, given that I don't know the grounds for limiting that evidence. But for Donald Trump, any limitation of the Attorney General's evidence is arguably a win. To the extent he may be referring to the appellate division, the prior decision by the appellate court in New York, you have the trial court, which is very confusingly called the Supreme Court. That's actually the lowest court in New York. Then you go to the appellate division. Trump's team had appealed to the appellate division, but the appellate division, you could say, on the whole, ruled against Trump because if they had ruled for him, he wouldn't be at trial. So, again, we're going to have to wait until we get a little more clarification. But if it's a matter of narrowing the evidence that's admissible, that could be a net positive for the defense team.
And I want to turn now, thank you, Danny. I want to turn now to NBC's Vaughn Hilliard, who was outside the courthouse. Vaughn, can you shed any more light on what just happened in the last, 20 minutes or so that the former president referenced? I don't know if you've been able to get a chance on any of the reporting, to see any of the reporting coming out of there?
Right. We're trying to communicate with some of our producers who are in the courtroom right now. There are no cameras inside of there. But to what Danny is speaking of is the outstanding question. And this was something that Donald Trump belabored earlier in the day, frustration that this court proceeding was taking place at all today and that the lawsuit continues to stand against him. When he talks about the statute of limitations, we're talking about a period pre-2014. There was an appellate court that back in June had determined that when it applied to Ivanka Trump, who was initially a defendant in this case, that she would no longer be a defendant, no longer be a part of this trial because her involvement was outside of the statute of limitations, pre-2014. And so Donald Trump and his attorneys argued that, therefore, the claims being laid out by New York Attorney General Letitia James should be from a more condensed time frame. And yet what happened last week was part of their argument, Donald Trump's attorney's argument, was that this this civil trial should not go forward until the appellate court determines whether the statute of limitations also applies to Donald Trump and the other defendants. Well, the appellate court said, sorry, the stay is lifted. The trial will begin on Monday, but seemingly leaving it a live ball type situation where the appellate court could potentially at some point rule in Donald Trump's favor that this is a more condensed period of time in which the lawsuit would have to be applied to. And so what we're now hearing from Donald Trump, at least, is that the judge seemed potentially open to that argument, consolidating the timeline of the claims laid out by the AG against Trump to after 2014. There's a lot of in the weeds there. We realize, Gabe, but obviously Donald Trump is arguing that that potentially the liability that he faces would be much smaller if, in fact, that is reality, because the Attorney General lays out claims that extend way beyond 2014 that could very well have major repercussions into the future.
And Vaughn, I know you covered the Trump campaign, and we just saw the former president once again trying to cast himself as a political victim here, saying that he was sitting in the courthouse all day. But Vaughn, he went in front of the cameras several times today, and as I understand it, he was fundraising quite a bit, or at least his team was, throughout the day, right?
Exactly. This is part of the idea of why is Donald Trump here? You know, Donald Trump said that he was taken off of the campaign trail in order to be here today, but the reality is that he didn't actually have to show up for the trial. He chose to. He's getting in his motorcade right now, departing. He stayed overnight at Trump Tower. It's not clear whether he is going to be coming back here for day 2 of trial. But for Donald Trump, yes, they sent out earlier today a fundraising email to supporters. Not only is that money going towards his own political campaign, but there's also a percentage of the money that goes to his leadership PAC, which is an outside organization that has paid more than $100 million worth of legal bills for him and others related to his numerous cases here. And so for Donald Trump, having some financial intake coming and stemming from these multiple trials is important for him. The other part, though, I want to note, Gabe, by Donald Trump being in the courtroom today, he was able to watch firsthand his 2-3 attorneys stand up there and defend him and watch that in real time. Because if Donald Trump isn't here in person, he's just like you and me. He's going to be outside of the courthouse wait for secondhand notes to come from those who were inside the courthouse, Gabe.
Vaughn, Hillier, Danny Savalas, thank you so much. I want to get right to our panel here, and join me now on set is Eugene Scott, senior politics reporter at Axios, Juanita Tolliver, Democratic strategist and an NBC News political analyst, and Sarah Chamberlain, president and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership. Thank you all so much for joining us here. And I want to start with you. How much does this help Donald Trump?
Well, we know that it helps him with his base, people who are already on the Trump train. And, you know, looking at the polls, he doesn't really need to do a whole lot more work to improve his standing against his competitors. But he does need to get these people to turn out, because this race in many states is going to be largely determined by independents and swing voters. Now, does this help him with those? It doesn't seem like it, quite frankly, based on focus groups we've done at Axios. These are individuals who are tired of the Trump show. But he needs those people that really like him and do believe that the Biden administration is targeting him to continue to believe that. And these press releases help further that narrative.
Eugene, how incredible is it to just look at the spectacle that's going on here, where a defendant is attacking the judge, insulting the judge just feet away. You know, he's doing that in the hallway, and you just saw in those live remarks that we just carried, thanking the judge, he says, for one ruling, and then going back and attacking him. Eugene, have you ever seen something like this?
We use unprecedented a lot. But it's true. It's so true. And I was on set during that first press conference and watching the pivot from this personal attack to we want to thank this judge, it's quite the shift. And one thing we know about Donald Trump is he makes quite a few shifts on issues, on policies, and how he even feels about people.
Well, before I walked in here, I got 4 fundraising requests.
Oh, really?
Just in the past hour.
Sarah, I want to bring you in on that.
Sure.
What are Republicans across the country thinking right now?
So the Republican Main Street Partnership polling shows exactly what you said, that the base loves him, but the swing voters and the Reagan-type Republicans would like to find a different candidate. There's no doubt about that. Will they succeed? It doesn't look like that. I mean, he has a commanding lead in the primaries.
And Juanita, with all these legal cases mounting against him, yes, most candidates would not want to be in this position, but he's sucking up all the oxygen.
Right.
He's raising a ton of money. Democrats looking at this, what's going through their heads as they look through another series of legal challenges facing Donald Trump? This is going to continue well into the election season.
I think Democrats see this and recognize that this is yet another campaign stop for Trump. He says he's not on the trail. This is very much him on the trail. He's in front of those cameras. He's feeding the lies to his base. He's rallying them up in the same way he would if he was in Iowa or New Hampshire or any other state he visits. I do think Democrats look at this and think, okay, he's still sucking up the oxygen, but when you have him in front of these cameras outside of trial doors, juxtaposed with President Biden actually delivering things for the people, actually speaking substantively about real issues impacting everyday lives, that's going to be the big difference.
We have several other things to get to on this panel regarding the shutdown averted, the future of Speaker McCarthy, but also the story that we were talking about right before we went to those live pictures. And Gavin Newsom's pick to replace Dianne Feinstein. Difficult situation for Governor Newsom right here. Is this just a no-win situation for him?
I think he was able to walk away from this and say he checked the box of delivering a black woman to the Senate. As you noted earlier, this is only the 3rd black woman that will serve in the Senate in its 200-plus-year history. But the reality is there's still some friction there about his previous statements about this being a limited role, this being a short-term position.
And it wasn't Barbara Lee.
And it wasn't Barbara Lee.
So what do Democrats think now? You know, are Democrats happy here? Is anyone happy here?
I think the overwhelming response is support LaFonza Butler. She is stepping into a big moment and a big role. She's pro-union, pro-women and pregnant people, pro-choice, a lot of positives coming with her that she could work on in the Senate. But there's a reality that everybody's kind of looking at Newsom, giving him a little bit of side-eye for how he handled this situation.
And what if she runs now in 2024?
I don't know if she will, right? And we'll be able to determine that pretty quickly if there is a staffing, process that accompanies this. But it will be an uphill battle, just as it has been for Barbara Lee in terms of fundraising and making her mark.
And Eugene, I want to switch now to another topic since there's so much going on now in the last few minutes. But regarding this, government shutdown and the future of Kevin McCarthy, what do you make of what happens next? Matt Gaetz, potentially bringing this motion to vacate in the next few days. Is the damage already done? Can Republicans govern here?
I mean, the damage has been done regarding whether or not they can stay unified under Kevin McCarthy's leadership since, day one. I mean, this is what the next chapter of that initial story we saw looks like. I think what I'm paying attention to right now is, for the most part, we really only hear Matt Gaetz coming out. There are not a lot of other names that have come out in terms of wanting to see McCarthy leave, and I haven't heard any names from any sources about who would replace him.
AOC?
Well, I mean...
If she had her way.
I can give you a lot of Democrats who would like to see Kevin McCarthy leave.
Well, you bring up a good point, though. I mean, yes, that you haven't heard a lot of Republicans. Now, Sarah, I wanted to turn to you. You work with a lot of moderates in frontline districts. How complicated are their lives now, thanks to Matt Gaetz?
Extremely complicated, but I am convinced that Matt Gaetz is going to go nowhere with us, and Kevin McCarthy will stay the Speaker.
Really?
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
And so, but what happens with this motion to vacate? You think it fails?
I think it fails.
Over and over again?
I think if he had the votes, he would bring it to the floor immediately. Yes. As you said, there's nobody else who's backing him. Even his good friend from Colorado, she's not even out there yet. So it doesn't look like he probably has the votes. And all of the Main Street members are behind Kevin McCarthy at this point. So I think Kevin survives this, and I think he should survive it.
Switching back, though, to politics now in California, there was one point that I wanted to make with you, Juanita, that I didn't. With Democrats now spending potentially heavily in this 2024 race among themselves, does that prevent them from spending elsewhere in other contested races across the country, Sarah?
So I think it does. So I'm actually really pleased to see the California situation, Sarah, because I think it changes the dynamic. I mean, West Virginia, Montana, it might be sucking up all the money to go to California, and I'd love to pick up those seats in the Senate and get the Senate majority.
Yeah, Juanita, is there a danger here if Democrats, have this infighting, and Adam Schiff, he timed that announcement saying he's raised so much money and has this massive war chest to try to fend off any challengers, I guess. What happens next among the Democrats, and is the money better spent elsewhere?
Well, first, I wouldn't describe this as infighting. I'd just say this is a normal primary process compared to what we see on the Republican presidential cycle right now. So I would say this is just going to play out. California has an early primary, March 2nd or 5th, I believe. So this will be over relatively soon. And then those dollars and resources can be spent elsewhere. But I do believe that Democrats across the country are still raising, still running, and still spending elsewhere.
All right, well, really quickly as we wrap up the panel, where do we see the presidential race right now with some of these Republican challengers? We have some reporting here that major Republican donors are summoning Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis later on this month to make their case. Are we getting to the point right now where this Republican primary is close to being over? Is it over already?
Well, I don't know that it's over already, but I think it's worth noting that when you add up everyone who was on that stage last week, they're still less than what Donald Trump has in terms of support. Right. And so the motivation for them to keep going, this is something donors are having a hard time trying to figure out if this is where they want to invest their time and money. And I think that's what's going to be at the heart of the conversation later this week.
And Sarah, isn't this the same thing that happened in 2016? Aren't these candidates just knocking each other off, and Donald Trump emerges victorious like he has before so many times?
Unfortunately, potentially, but I really do think that they're playing for number two, and their hopes that if something happens to Trump and his 91, 92 convictions now, or charges, that they're playing for number two. And they're hoping to be a strong number two so they can come out. If he steps away, they're ready to go against President Biden. And I actually think there's a number of them that can defeat President Biden.
Sarah, Juanita, and Eugene, thank you so much for joining us here on Meet the Press Now. And still to come, leveling the playing field. We're digging into the future of sports and gender equality and how trans athletes found themselves at the center of one of the most divisive issues in U.S. politics. You're watching Meet the Press Now. And welcome back. A new law aimed at restricting gender-affirming care for transgender youth went into effect in Nebraska this weekend, keeping transgender kids from receiving some gender-affirming care until they're 19 years old. The law is in effect, but parents and doctors say care guidelines have yet to be released. Nebraska is not the only state where the fight over gender-affirming care has played out in recent days. Late last week, federal courts upheld bans on care in Kentucky and Tennessee. In Montana, a judge temporarily halted a similar law that would have also gone into effect yesterday. According to trackers, in 2023 alone, more than 83 anti-trans bills have passed in state legislatures across the U.S. And while health care has now become a major policy focus, legislation around trans kids came into the mainstream with a fight over trans kids in sports. And that is the subject of the new book, Fair Play, How Sports Shape the Gender Debates. And author Katie Barnes joins me now. They also cover the intersection of sports and gender as a features writer for ESPN. Katie, thanks so much for joining us here. Now, your book tracks the emergence of regulations and legislation around transgender kid in sports. And why has sports become such a flashpoint here? What is it about sports that really has thrust this issue into the mainstream discussion?
Well, Americans love sports.
Right.
I think that's a big part of it. We have our own experiences, our own emotional ties to sports. And also, when it comes to the arguments being made in favor of restriction, they can be very simple arguments, such as the one that's most commonly parroted, which is boys shouldn't play girls' sports. Most people agree with that statement. But as we know, the issue that's being discussed, both legislatively and in communities across the country, is much more complex than that.
Why do you think this has become such a wedge issue?
I think really because it preys on a lot of our assumptions about both sports and gender, which is that from a sports perspective, many of us culturally are taught that anyone assigned male at birth is a better athlete than anyone assigned female at birth, and that is true in most circumstances. And when you have folks who blur the boundaries in terms of how we think about sex traditionally, biologically, or how we think about gender, and that then is overlaid with sports, it becomes very complicated very quickly.
And, you know, in terms of politics, over the last couple of months, I was on the Republican campaign trail. I spoke with a lot of voters, and I was also covering the candidacy of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. And when I was in places like Iowa especially, I would speak with voters, and this wasn't the top issue that they would mention. They would talk about the economy. However, when Governor DeSantis and other GOP candidates, when they would bring it up in their speeches, it did seem to get a lot of a response. Why do you think Republican candidates specifically are using this issue of, you know, trans rights or lack thereof, or this issue of sports and trans youth? Why are they latching onto this issue among their base?
I can't speak to the motivations of individual politicians, but what we do know from the ways that these bills have passed in state houses across the country is that they have done so in largely partisan lines, and that this issue is very animating for a particular segment of American society, and that it's covered really rigorously and consistently. And also it comes up in the politics of some of the more rightward-leaning areas of our country. That said, those aren't the only people who care about this topic. It's been my experience as a reporter that a lot of folks from all walks of life have a number of questions and simply don't know where to turn to get those questions answered.
And I want to read from a portion of your book. One of the big ideas driving the discussion of, you know, trans people, particularly trans girls and women, is that they are winning in sports all the time. And you wrote that the media and public often respond to transgender girls or women winning in their respective sports, which creates the perception that transgender girls and women win all the time. That narrative, however, is incomplete, you write. So what did you find when you investigated this?
That transgender girls and transgender athletes broadly both win and lose and are mediocre, like the rest of us. There's a wide range.
You mean they're not all winning on top of their sport?
They're not all elite athletes. They're not all championship caliber athletes.
Why do you think, though, then those cases get the most attention?
Well, because there's a certain level of emotional response. There's, I think, a lot of outcry from certain folks that anytime a transgender girl wins, that is an unfair result. But I will say that we've started to see this narrative shift toward any participation of a transgender girl in girls' sports at all is seen as a failure of policy. And we're seeing that even in states that don't have restrictive policy, that there's a public response to the knowledge of a transgender girl competing in the girls' category. There's been a dust-up in California. There have been dust-ups in Vermont, where these have been publicly discussed, even though they don't have restrictive policy.
And Katie, I know we're running low on time, but I want to get to this. At the end of the book, you have a chapter where you explain where you currently come down on the policies. You landed on no restrictions in childhood regulation and intramural sports, and gradual regulations competing in elite levels. Really briefly, why did you feel it was important for you to actually come out on the side?
I think if I'm asking people to read 300 pages of reported thoughts from other folks, that if readers are investing that time, the natural question that they're going to have is, okay, well, what does this person think who's been writing this book? And I felt that they were entitled to a real answer from me, and that's why I gave it.
Katie Barnes, thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate it. And the book is Fair Play, How Sports Shape the Gender Debates. I'm back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. Our coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.